Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the next frontier human development and Anthropocene and nature-based solutions in Latin America and the Caribbean. Without any further ado, let's welcome our chair, Mrs. Carolina Rivera, to open the session. Mrs. Carolina Rivera, the screen is yours.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here in this panel from UNDP. We're joining forces the Human Development Report Office and the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean. And what you're going to listen today is for three presentations. The first one from Pedro Conceição, Director of the Human Development Report Office. The second one will be myself, talking also about another aspect of the Human Development Report. And finally, we're going to listen to Almudena Fernandez, who is the advisor to the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean. So, Pedro, you can start with your presentation.
Thank you, Carolina. Great to be with you and with Almudena. And I would like to share my screen. And what I'll try to do is to go over briefly the main findings of our latest Human Development Report that we published in December 2020. I'll cover some aspects and then Carolina will go a little bit more in depth in some of the aspects that I will mention briefly, and I will note as I go through my presentation where Carolina will elaborate further. So the Human Development Report 2020 attempted to do three things. First, to look at and consider what is the meaning of expanding human development, this aspiration of expanding human development in a context that has been described by many as the Anthropocene. And this is a term that's still being debated by geologists on whether it should be formally used to classify a new geological epoch. But the evidence seems to be very clear that human activity is destabilizing planetary systems at a global scale in a way that does not seem to have precedent in human history and not even in the history of our planet. Secondly, we explore what are potential mechanisms of change that will enable people to make different choices towards easing these planetary pressures, and at the same time continue to enable people to expand human development. And finally, we explore new metrics. So how can we account for, in the set of indicators that we consider when looking at human development, how to account for these planetary pressures and interactions between them and the other metrics that we use for human development, including the Human Development Index. So this is what I'll briefly cover. I will start first with a few more comments on the Anthropocene, why the evidence suggests that it's something unprecedented, and how this interacts with what we call social imbalances, a number of inequalities. Second, I will go over the metrics that we put forward, and then finally, very briefly, I will mention these mechanisms of change, because this is one area in which Carolina will develop a little bit further, and then Almudena will also give specific examples of how one of these mechanisms of change, nature-based human development, is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think it's very important that this Human Development Report, which was published 30 years after the first Human Development Report was published, is not another sustainability report. Concerns with the environment and sustainability have been covered over the years in many human development reports. It really tries to take a new look at the human development approach and concept, and argues that we can actually continue to expand human development while easing planetary pressures if we double down on the core notion of human development that relates to the importance of not only expanding capabilities, but also putting an emphasis on human agency, the ability of people to reason and to come to make different choices individually and collectively. And another important aspect is that it suggests that it's important to have an integrated approach that goes deeper into trying to understand what are the underlying drivers of these complex planetary changes, as opposed to trying to look at separate problems one at a time without seeing the connection across them. So some quick data on the Anthropocene or the evidence that is leading many to call for this epoch as the Anthropocene. One has to do with the impact that humans are having in shaping the evolution of life on Earth. So if you take the weight of domestic poultry that is bred currently for human consumption is 3 times that of all wild birds. And this is just an example of how we are actually shaping the evolution of plants and animals that will leave legacies over hundreds of millions of years, in contrast with the fact that we as a species have been around only for a little over 300,000 years. Another example is the use of artificial fertilizers, which has increased 8-fold since 1960 up to the turn of the century. And this represents the largest disturbance on the nitrogen biogeochemical cycle in the last 2.5 billion years. The Earth has existed for 5.6 billion years or so. So you can see how much of a disturbance this shock represents. There's also evidence using a number of indicators by what has been called the great acceleration. So here I give examples related to the increase in the use of aluminium, which was really a material that was almost unknown in native form until the 19th century. And 98% of its global cumulative production has occurred since the turn of the 20th century. Or concrete, which has been known for a long time since the Romans, but half of all of the concrete produced in human history was produced in the last 20 years. And use of different construction, mining, waste, urbanization, which represent the greatest expansion of new minerals in the last 2.5 billion years in the history of our planet. So I've used all of these examples without mentioning even once climate change, because this is an illustration of how climate change and perhaps even COVID-19 are some of the illustrations of these changes that are happening at the planetary scale. COVID-19 is, we don't know exactly how it emerged, but it's likely to be just the latest in a series of zoonotic diseases, diseases that jump from animals to human, that we know are associated with the increase in planetary pressures, particularly land change use and pressures on biodiversity. So the argument in the report is that as these shocks materialize, they are likely to exacerbate inequalities. So in the case of COVID-19, there's evidence that has been clearly the case when it comes to gender inequality, which has increased as a result, in part because the economic sectors affected are sectors in which women are overrepresented, but also because some of the social norms related to the expectations on the role of women in childcare, for instance, have asserted themselves. So women appear to have pulled back from the labor force. But it goes beyond COVID-19. If we look at a series of ecological threats related to droughts and other extreme weather hazards, we see on the chart on the left that the higher the level of ecological threat, the higher the level of the gender inequality index. And this actually applies to inequalities in human development more broadly. You see the same pattern emerging on the graph on the right. So there's an interaction between these shocks that result from planetary pressures and the exacerbation of inequalities. But inequalities are also related to asymmetries in power, in voice, and in the contributions between those that over-extract and over-pollute and those bearing the consequences. So in this chart, you see that the red lines represents that in a no climate change mitigation scenario, countries with low human development could see up to 100 days more of extreme temperature by the end of the 21st century, while very high human development countries will actually see a reduction in the number of days with extreme temperature. So this shows that those that have contributed the least, which are countries with high human development or low human development, those that have contributed the least to climate change will actually suffer the biggest losses. Now, a central message of the report is that all of this is not inevitable and depends on the choices that we make. And here the blue lines illustrate that under a moderate mitigation scenario, those 100 days more of extreme temperature by the end of the century in low human development countries could actually be cut in half. So the report puts an emphasis on trying to understand what could be done to enable people to make different choices. And one of the proposals is to introduce new metrics. So let me cover now our reasoning in the introduction of a new metric, what we will ultimately call the Planetary Pressures Index. So the reason has to do with the fact that life, all forms of life, the biosphere, depends on energy. And you see here a graph that represents in the evolution of our planet and in the evolution of human societies, the use of energy by the biosphere as a whole on the top, and the use of energy by human societies. And one of the striking facts is that the two are getting closer, especially after the industrial transition, which again speaks to the new reality of the Anthropocene, but also that the use of fossil fuels has been the transformational driver towards enabling human societies to basically achieve what we have today. So use of energy is something that essentially for all forms of life, for our human societies, but the other element that is crucial are materials, nutrients in the case of all forms of life. And if you take the analogy for human societies, energy and materials are the two elements that are needed for our societies to function. So what has been happening is that the planetary pressures that we're putting on the planet are related intimately to the way in which we use energy and materials. And therefore, we constructed an index of planetary pressures that is a combination of the impact related to the emissions of CO2, carbon dioxide, and the material footprint, both on a per person basis. So if you contrast this index of planetary pressures with the Human Development Index, what you see clearly is that no country currently is in the aspirational space of high human development and low planetary pressures, which represented here by this green triangle. The blue dots show how countries stand in the Human Development Index and in this index of planetary pressures. So making different choices implies if you want to move in the direction of the arrow towards that triangle. And to do so, and I'll conclude, we suggest that it's important to consider a number of mechanisms for change that can engage different actors. Governments, policymakers here have certainly a critical role, but there are other actors, business, civil society, all of us as individuals can play a role in activating these mechanisms for change. One has to do with the social norms. We know that what drives people's behavior often is what people around us do and expect us to do. So these can harness to ease planetary pressures. Incentives and regulations are obviously critical in our market economies. Prices, getting prices right, be it pricing carbon, reducing fossil fuel subsidies, are central, a number of regulations, but also important to continue to invest, especially in technology. And then finally, looking at nature not as a constraint, but actually as a potential driver and enabler of human development, while at the same time protecting and restoring ecosystems. So thank you very much. I invite you to take a look at the report. You see the website on this slide, and looking forward to your questions and comments. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, Pedro, for your presentation. I also want to remind everyone that we have a Q&A box, so you can start posting your questions there, and I will be reading them at the end. So now I'm gonna share my screen also. So I'm gonna continue with the presentation of the Human Development Report 2020, but focusing more on how we want to empower people through nature in the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene implies enormous uncertainty for people and societies, and the risks that we are facing are not only greater, but they are also different. The notion of risk faced by people is changing as the risks reflect a new complex interrelation of planetary changes and social imbalances. So some of the risks that we are facing now, for instance, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the latest consequence of planetary imbalances. Scientists have long warned that diseases will emerge more often from interactions between people and wildlife. Interactions that have steadily increased in scale and intensity, squeezing ecosystems so hard that deadly viruses spill out, and the novel coronavirus is not the first such virus and will not be the last one. On the other side, climate change is weakening economic progress and increasing inequalities. In most countries, GDP per capita is lower than it would have been without climate change, particularly for lower income countries, where it is estimated to be between 17 and 31% lower. And overall, cross-country income inequality is estimated to be 25% higher because of climate change. Also, after 2 decades of progress, the number of people affected by hunger has been increasing since 2014, and it will continue according to the forecasts considering the effect of the pandemic. Finally, recent scientific reports suggest that the effects on natural hazards have been increasing since the turn of the millennium. Most of the increased economic costs from natural hazards has been for developed countries, but most of the increase in human costs have been in developing countries. So if we go to the first shock, COVID-19 has spread quickly around an interconnected world, taking root wherever it has landed and thriving, especially in the cracks of societies, exploiting and exacerbating inequalities in human development. In too many cases, those cracks have hamstrung efforts to control the virus. And this is a human development crisis as well. The shock is affecting the main components of human development with unprecedented magnitude, synchronicity, and global reach. As you can see in the figure, the pandemic has caused a fallout on education, health, and income, and this threatens to reverse global progress in human development for the first time since we began counting it in 1990. When environmental shocks as COVID-19 interact with the existing inequalities in our societies, then empowerment gaps widen. An example of this is for women and girls, who are disproportionately affected by shocks because of traditional roles and norms. Their greater participation in unpaid care work, which has increased with the lockdowns, has affected the labor force participation. In this graph, you can see an example for how the labor force participation rate of women in Mexico, Chile, and Colombia has decreased more than 20% per year, which is equivalent to decades of progress. Also, the number of people affected by hunger has been increasing since 2014, and it is estimated by 2030, 900 million people could be undernourished. And this trend is touching a large share of the global population. The inflection point, as you can see here, in the trajectory of progress in food security is due to multiple factors: deteriorating economic conditions, weak positions in global value chains, and large inequalities in the distribution of income, assets, and resources. But also, anthropogenic shocks appear to be the newest driver of hunger, specifically the increasing frequency of extreme weather events, altered environmental conditions, and the associated spread of pests and diseases, such as COVID-19. Another aspect is that natural hazards are continuing to trigger most of the new displacements in 2020. The expected annual number of people displaced after 2020 is close to 14 million globally. And 72% of these displacements will be due to floods, as you can see in the figure. Many people born in areas with low carbon footprints are more likely to migrate to areas with high carbon footprints. Migration is taken as an adaptation strategy, but there are social patterns of discrimination and exclusion that often persist after people move. And displacement can also be different by sex. For instance, in 141 countries between 1980 and 2002, disasters killed more women than men on average. Women's displacement can be linked to their role and status in society, because women might be unwilling to evacuate because of cultural reasons or not being able to swim or escape as fast as men. But even when women survive to disasters, they are at greater risk of displacement because they are more affected by food insecurity, they are overrepresented in the agriculture sector, and so have greater dependence on forests, lands, rivers, and rainfall. And finally, weather changes affect how women allocate time to paid and unpaid care work. So as we can see with this, planetary shocks can reinforce patterns of disempowerment of specific groups. The impacts of planetary change are diverse and context-specific. When new shocks interact with the existing intersecting horizontal inequalities, they can reinforce patterns of disempowerment of groups such as women, children, youth, Black people, and Indigenous peoples. As part of our analysis for this report on how the Anthropocene risks is affecting human development, we explored how planetary change and shocks can reinforce patterns of disempowerment of disadvantaged groups, considering three main aspects of equity and empowerment. The first one is recognitional equity, which refers to the recognition of interest holders and the respect for their identity, their values, and their rights. Empowerment is positively associated with the recognition of human rights and principles of non-discrimination. The second one will be distributional equity, which refers to the distribution of resources, costs, and benefits among people and groups. The access to resources enhances an individual's ability to choose, so those resources are channels to exercise empowerment and agency. And finally, we talk about procedural equity, which relates on how decisions are being made about institutions, governance, and participation. Representation, power, and voice are linked directly to empowerment, as they shape how communities and individuals have the ability to influence and participate in decision-making to achieve their desired outcomes and goals. Addressing asymmetries in these three key areas will seek to enhance the power of groups that are often unseen, unheard, and undervalued, and then guarantee environmental justice. So to do this, as Pedro already mentioned, we present three mechanisms for change. In the report, we argue it is possible to pursue collective solutions that are embedded in changing social norms, improving incentives, and working with and not against nature. In the first case, we need a change in social norms. Data has been already showing that almost 80% of people think it is important to protect the planet, but they are often not able to act on their values because of adverse incentives or persisting social norms that detrimentally affect the planet. So these people need to be empowered to act on their values and exercise their agency. The examples I'm presenting here are focused on Latin America to build a bridge to the next presentation. In the case of social norms, we have a female education program in Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic that contributes to long-term resilience from natural disasters. As I was telling you before, women are one of the most affected groups by natural hazards, and this is a way of empowering them. On the second part, we need incentives and regulations to help bridge the gap between behaviors and values. In this case, there's the example of valuation of wetlands in Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and the collective payments for ecosystem services in the case of Mexico. And finally, we need to pursue nature-based solutions that create a virtuous cycle between human development and planetary health. For example, restoring a forest can reduce greenhouse gases emissions, or protecting fresh water, or preserving biodiversity, and providing a sustainable source for food. In this case, we have example of a coral reef insurance in Mexico, a fund to protect water in Ecuador, the mapping of natural areas in Costa Rica, and the empowerment of indigenous farmers in Jamaica. Social norms and incentives can be harnessed for transformational change, and so can a new generation of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions refer to actions that protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems while simultaneously promoting well-being. These are a manifestation of people empowered in ways that enhance equity, then foster innovation, and are rooted in a sense of stewardship of nature. Nature-based solutions are typically bottom-up, with a proliferation of new initiatives in different contexts, and they often rely on the participation and initiative of indigenous peoples and local communities. Expanding human agency will imply empowering people by enhancing equity, fostering innovation, and installing a sense of stewardship of nature. Nature-based solutions can add up to a substantial impact. A nature-based human development shifts the focus from specific solutions towards including human agency and to the broader determinants of local empowerment to advance human development and preserve the integrity of the biosphere. Supporting the practices of indigenous people that sustain biodiversity is key, especially since the lands managed by indigenous people will be around 25% of the global land area, host an estimated 80% of global biodiversity. But what is happening here is that indigenous people have been pioneers, but also vulnerable at the same time. They have demonstrated to have valuable knowledge and practices for the preservation of the planetary systems. So over the past few decades, indigenous peoples have been on the front line of defending the Amazon rainforest. Throughout the Amazon basin, territories managed by indigenous people show less forest loss than the average in other territories. So if you look at the first figure, you can see how the per capita contribution of indigenous people here in the last bar is greater than the average per capita emission of the top 1% of the largest global emitters. But at the same time, indigenous people also have a high presence, around 40%, as defenders of nature and in environmental activism. But they are disproportionately affected by violence and persecution. You can see in the second figure the yearly killings of environmental activists. More than 66% of the 212 murders of environmental defenders happened in Latin America, and mainly in Amazon countries. So it is time to chart bold new paths. We need to recognize and support the contribution of local communities and indigenous peoples, and this recognition is key to ease planetary pressures. Also, recognizing ongoing injustices suffered by the communities and the way they shape their agency and ability to thrive. Finally, human development that tackles inequality and empowers people will offer a pathway towards a balance between people and nature. Thank you very much. And as Pedro, I invite you to check the Human Development Report. And I will give the word to Almudena to continue with her presentation.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Let me share my screen. So a very special thank you to Pedro and Carolina for allowing the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean of UNDP to be part of this very important panel. I'm here on behalf of our Regional Director, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, and I will be presenting some preliminary findings of ongoing research that we're working with, that our UNDP Latin American Caribbean Environment Team is working with the Northeastern University School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. The aim of this research is to understand the impacts that nature-based solutions are having on household well-being on the ground in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how these, when aggregated, can support both sustainability and growth in the long term. As you heard from my colleagues already, the Human Development 2020 argues for 3 levels of levers of change to promote human development that eliminates planetary pressures. Social norms that have to do with what is acceptable and not acceptable in a society, incentives and regulations, which have to do with pricing of different mechanisms and different regulations, and nature-based solutions, which is what I'll be focusing on in this presentation today. As a catalyst for change for both household communities, but also for countries and planets in the aggregate. So as Carolina just mentioned, and just for clarity, we're understanding nature-based solutions as actions that promote, protect sustainable management and restore ecosystems while simultaneously promoting human well-being. So that's the type of solutions that we're focusing on right now. The report argues, and I think that this is a very interesting annotation, that there's 2 reasons why nature-based solutions can result in transformational change. One has to do with and Carolina mentioned this a bit, how local action, when added, can have a very global impact. And the report analyzes different ways in which these can be done, such as fossil fuel mitigation and forests, etc. The second one is because socioeconomic and planetary systems are very, very deeply connected. So how thinking about initiatives that tackle both issues, that kind of address both systems simultaneously, can have a very multiplying effect and can have a very can maximize impact of interventions. So what we'll be discussing right now is the second effect and how the mechanisms through which nature-based solutions improve households' well-being, creating a virtuous cycle between environmental stewardship and growth. We will do so by looking at nature-based solutions, at the impact of nature-based solutions on households through an asset-based approach. The idea is there's various channels through which nature-based solutions have a positive income on households. And we know many of these. There's a possibility of job creation. There's a possibility of increased yields of agricultural land. There's a possibility of improved environmental services that can increase the returns of different productive assets. But we want to look at it because the impacts are so widespread and so interconnected among each other, we want to kind of present a framework where we can look at it in a more systematic way. So this is where the asset-based approach comes in. The asset-based approach, this asset-based approach was developed by Busolo, Lopez Calva, and Rodriguez. And it argues that the capacities of households to generate income and thus derive well-being depends on the assets they hold, the different types of assets that they have at their availability, and we'll go a little bit more into which are these types of assets, how they use these assets and their ability to actually use them and how intensely these can be used. And the markets and functionings market functionings that they have around these assets, so they can actually generate benefit from them. So in the way of prices. It also takes into account non-market income families receive, such as government transfers or remittances from family members above. So all of this together kind of is a systematic way to look at how household income generating capacity as a proxy, as an indicator of household well-being. The approach also allows for taking into account how broader variables, both macroeconomic, climatic, and environmental variables, can affect households through impacts on each of these components of the income generating process. So for example, how changes in demand for labor have an impact on the ability to use human capital to generate income, or how climate events such as drought or floods can have a real impact on the intensity through which you can use certain physical assets such as land. So the approach allows for taking these things into account. The approach is multidimensional by construction, and it considers various types of assets. The first one, human capital, having to do with, of course, education and health, but it also considers physical capital, which has to do with infrastructure such as housing, land, machinery, tools that allow for productivity. Financial capital, which includes savings and loans and credit and access to markets. Social capital, which has to do with a connection with other people as it relates to ability to generate income. And finally, natural capital, as it relates to different services provided by the environment that have a real impact on productivity of both physical, human, and other assets. So for example, soil quality, water quality, air quality. So all of natural capital that is available to households to kind of transform different assets into productive assets. The idea is that this framework can allow us to systematically unpack the primary channels through which nature-based solutions applied at the local level and based on the local context, it can have an impact on household well-being and bring about transformational change. So to do this, we focus on 5 large UNDP-supported projects in Latin America and the Caribbean, nature-based solutions, to try and kind of unpack these effects and kind of understand what are the different transmission channels and how these can interrelate to each other, because a lot of them are quite interrelated. There are a few pathways through which nature-based solutions derive into increased capacity of households to generate income. Just for illustration purposes, I'll go in through a few examples, but this is by no means comprehensive. But for example, projects that invest in climate resilient and sustainable local industries, such as tourism, can lead to increased economic activity, aim to lead to increased economic activity, and this has impacts both in direct and indirect job creation as new industries, local industries develop. It can increase the returns to both physical and natural capital as there's higher demand for the use of these capital. And it can also increase opportunities for different types of livelihoods. Another example, another pathway is investments in climate resilient productive landscapes or seascapes. So investments in improving the agricultural techniques or agricultural technology towards more resilient use of land or sea. And this aims to improve agricultural productivity, increase yields and opportunities for new projects. And this, of course, derives in improved livelihood opportunities as new products are developed and increased yields of whatever assets are already contained in the household, but also can have an important impact on improved food security, which has an impact in health and of course, human capital accumulation. Other types of initiatives have to do with conservation incentives. Some examples of these have to do with payment for environmental services, certifications of organic products or good agriculture practices products, or other projects to improve agricultural technology. And these again can lead to increased livelihood opportunities, improved health because of less use of toxic chemicals in the land, but also increased social capital as communities of producers are formed through these conservation investments. So there's many different ways in which we see an impact on household assets at many different levels. So just to finish, I want to show you some of the preliminaries we're finding. And basically what we see, the main message is nature-based solutions has the impact to have have the potential to have a real impact on household well-being in many different senses. And it has to do with the very different types of capital that they can actually potentiate and the ways in which they can do it. So I'll just go through a little bit of kind of the broad areas where we see there's real impact, and I'll just use a few examples from our project to finish off. So for example, if we look at human capital accumulation, so nature-based solutions that try and increase agricultural yield and support different ecosystems. Like I mentioned, they can increase, we see in the project that we looked at that there is an improvement in food security, both because of improved agricultural yields, but also because through nature-based solutions, there's also an increased access to different markets which can mitigate the risk of food insecurity. There's a potential for improved health from using fewer toxic chemicals. And also some nature-based solutions projects focus on the diversification of productive activity and capacity building around these. So there is the potential for acquisition of new productive skills that in turn increase a household's ability to use their human capital for productive and for income generating purposes. In terms of its intensity of use, like I mentioned, there's a real direct connection with job creation from the projects themselves, but more perhaps from indirect spillover effects as local economy, local industries grow, as certain areas as certain products enter international markets and the demand for them grow. So there's the possibility for job creation and livelihood opportunities. And there is also a higher return to labor due to increased productivity and increased demand. And one example of this is a project in Grenada that we examined. It focused on increased eco and agritourism, which led to new job opportunities for guides, operators, entertainers, local producers, boat operators, all the jobs that surge around the tourism industry. But it also invested in women-owned small businesses with grants for skills and adaptation initiatives, trainings, and marketing support. So we see very real job creation, but at the same time, an acquiring of new skills that can eventually also generate additional jobs and create additional well-being for the household. In terms of physical capital, projects that improve the quality of the land, that improve the quality of the ecosystems, were seen to have higher livestock yields, so it increased in the physical assets held by the household. Increased diversity and volume of fauna. For example, this was seen in fisheries as the ecosystem improved, which can be used then as productive assets. And also there's a strong focus on asset diversification that can add physical assets to households. For example, some projects focused on asset diversification, bringing in beehives and bee cultivation into households as a mechanism to diversify income. This is all new capital for the household. And well, in terms of intensity and returns, we see increased productivity, and of course that leads to higher returns. One example is Guatemala, where women-managed family gardens were established in different households to ensure food security and for further further use as products. The third type of capital, financial capital, this is an interesting one because it's not as that direct impact, but a lot of the projects that nature-based solutions also focus on access to international markets, of bringing communities of producers together, certifying their products, providing as a group access to credit for whatever investments are needed to then enter an international market. So we see that there's a real impact in the type of financial capital that households have at their disposal because they're part of these nature-based solutions. So there's increased access to market, they increase access to financial services, and improve returns eventually because they have the capacity to enter international markets and international value chains. So for example, in Ecuador, sustainable production is encouraged by market and credit, providing market and credit for participants for high conservation of cocoa production, which is now being used to enter the European market, which pays up to 3 times more for the product than would the national market. So there's a real value in accessing this international value chains. Social capital is also an interesting one because a lot of the projects focus on creating communities of farmers, creating seed banks, which kind of like distribute the risk of certain bad outcomes, and creating these communities so that the communities can access to different markets and have different returns and values for their products. So there's a real increase in social capital as these communities are organized around certification, around working together to meet the demands of other markets. So for example, in Guatemala, a group of small producers was certified through good agricultural practices and products, which led to increased premiums for their products. And finally, natural capital, I think this is the most direct impact that we see, but increased health of ecosystems, increased health of soil, increased biodiversity accumulation, water quality, reduced pollution, all are proven to result in both better health for the communities and increased yields to whatever assets they already have. So there's also a very clear impact. And we have an example from Colombia. So I think this is, like I said, is preliminary findings. We're working to kind of expand this research and really kind of systematizing the impacts as we see them and making these links between the different impacts there is. But I think what we're seeing very clearly is that, as the Human Development Report 2020 argues, nature-based solutions are one important mechanism through which human development and planetary health can be expanded. Starting at the local level, placing human agency at the center, and adding up to a global impact, both in terms of sustainability and growth. Thank you very much. Over to you, Caro.
Thanks so much, Almudena, for such a great presentation. It's always really good to see how what we are working at the global level resonates at the local level and the work you are doing with country offices. So I encourage everyone to post in the Q&A box in case you have a question for any of us. And in the meantime, I think I'm gonna ask you a question, Almudena, from what you were presenting. I was very happy to see in the latest examples that you were mentioning 2 projects that included women, and also including the Caribbean, because I think that's sometimes the comment, and having Grenada and Cuba. And regarding the inclusion of women and this gender aspect, did you plan this since the beginning of the research to have like some projects focused on women? And are you planning to have like a separate section from the research, or do an analysis focused on how is gender different for nature-based solutions?
Thank you, Caro. We didn't plan to have a different projects, specific projects that had a gender component in this research. But we do find that most of the projects that we've been working on from UNDP that we've been supporting have a very strong gender component to them. So I think most of the projects that you would find on nature-based solutions in the region, at least, which is the project that I know, have a very strong gender component by design, but also because there is a very strong gender case to be made once you start applying these gender-based solutions to focus on women as agents of change, as agents of holding the family agriculture, as agents for diversifying productive mechanism. And as you mentioned in the report, we see that a lot of the local activists in terms of environment in the region, in the world are from the region, and a big chunk of that is women. So I think it's just kind of by design because of where we stand with the UNDP, but also because I don't think you can think about these kind of projects without having a gender component because of the importance of the role that women play at the household level in these types of communities. I think once we continue the research, having a gender aspect would be fantastic. We hadn't thought about that, but I think that suggestion we'll take with us because I think there's a lot of findings and a lot of things to be said about that. Over.
Yeah, and has there been any finding specifically for Indigenous population, or any of the example has a component of Indigenous peoples?
Some of them are working with Indigenous communities, but we haven't differentiated the impacts at this point. But I think that's also a very interesting, and I think another part of the research as we move forward, because the idea would be to add more projects. Like right now we focus on 5 because we have very good data on those 5 projects, and they have been like long ongoing projects that are kind of coming to an end soon. But I think moving forward, we would like to focus a bit more on projects that have a more specific, working specifically with Indigenous communities, particularly supporting knowledge that is already on the ground in terms of how they are managing the environment, and kind of thinking about what are the potential for scaling those initiatives up.
That sounds great. So far, we don't have any questions in the Q&A, but I don't know if you have questions for each other, Pedro or Almudena.
Can I ask a question to both you
Yes.
and Almudena? So it's related to the discussion we're having on Indigenous peoples. One of the approaches to learn from Indigenous peoples is to observe some of their practices and then replicate in contexts of conservation, for instance. I think that there's something perhaps unethical about doing this, because it's could be seen as extracting or mining their knowledge only for particular purposes. So I think the message in our report about empowering Indigenous peoples and local communities is, I think, very, very important. So maybe if I could ask you both to reflect on this, and Almudena, maybe in your case, in the context of a region where there's really almost a paradox, because it's a region where Indigenous peoples are often persecuted, but also one where there's perhaps greater awareness of their potential, and also very good initiatives to empower them. So any comments, thoughts that you would have on this question?
How do you want to go first?
I don't know if, yeah, I can start. So I think the key for this is kind of what I concluded in my presentation, that is, we need to recognize the injustices Indigenous people have suffered in the past. And when we are, I don't know, replicating or taking on the knowledge and the experiences they have, also acknowledging and recognizing that it's their experience and their knowledge, and we are taking from them. So the empowerment is from them, and we are just learning there. I think with that, it's something possible and it can be done. And especially in the region for Latin America, because it has so many Indigenous environmental activists.
Yeah, I think, Pedro, as you mentioned, I think the message on the report on this is spot on. I think it's about empowering knowledge and solutions that are already being applied at the local level, and to see if there's potential for scaling, and there might not be, given these are very local specific solutions and initiatives, and by definition, right? Because they're meant to be. So I think it's critical to really focus on that, like, and I really like how the report does this, on the agency of the people on the ground to kind of find these, because nature-based solutions can be a lot of things, right? So to find what works for them in terms that, I think the focus really needs to be in terms of, let's think about these things in parallel. And I think perhaps nature-based solutions have been part of the portfolio of the environmental domain, right? These are projects by the Environment Ministry of the countries. And of course, they have, also by design, a human well-being component to them. While maybe the social development ministries in countries are thinking about more, poverty reduction programs that can have an environmental component to them. But how do we think about this together, right? How do we really kind of design for these, like, maximizing effect and virtuous cycle between environmental stewardship and household well-being, which eventually adds up to economic growth.
I have one more question, Carolina.
Yes, go ahead, Pedro. You can ask your question.
Thank you. Almudena, I don't know if you reflected on the potential of the asset-based approach to work in those contexts of where many indigenous peoples live or local communities, where markets may not be functioning. So the way in which prices work might be distorted. So that could be I don't know if you've done any work, but it could be an interesting extension to try to adapt or understand the extent to which the asset-based approach work in those contexts also.
I think that's really, we haven't reflected at this point in the research, but I think that's very interesting, because a lot of the, these nature-based projects are very multidimensional by themselves, right? They're not just like one payment for environmental services, but they usually involve a wide array of different services and of different components that add up to a project. So it'll be really interesting to look at, a lot of them have components of this, like allowing local communities to have access to markets that they don't traditionally have. And like I was mentioning, it's about, adding, creating communities of producers that can act as a group to access these markets while individual producers might not. So it's about kind of aggregating this and building this social capital so they have access. So it'll be really interesting, with a focus on indigenous community, how does that work, if that works, or if there's anything that we need to kind of be aware of in this process moving from, if this is something that is beneficial or not, right? I think there's a lot of nuance in that approach.
So I think we're already over time. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar, and thank you Almudena and Pedro for your presentations. And we invite you to check more of the report and the work that the Regional Bureau is doing, and following us in social media. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Pedro.